This video is sponsored by WorldAnvil. For the past few months, I've been running an in-person campaign for a bunch of relatively new players, as I'm also getting more familiar with D&D 2024, and I've been making a very conscious effort to not plan out the entire campaign in advance. My players are generally responding well to episodic adventures. They like quests they can complete in a single session because they like leveling up, they like getting cool new magic items, they like having clear goals, so they've been diving into a lot of dungeons. And that's meant I've basically had to invent a new dungeon for each session, with new lore and new plot hooks every time. And that can be tough. In fact, in our June session, I wound up having to improvise an entire dungeon basically on the spot, although I heavily borrowed from a dungeon I'd seen somewhere else, and we'll discuss that in a future video. But as they left that dungeon, they got their hands on a magic shield that would lead them to 2 other shields. So this was basically the first item in a multi-item magic item quest. And that essentially meant I was going to open our July session by giving my players the equivalent of a treasure map. And so the time has come for me to finally draw a map of the local area for my players. See, all these adventures are taking place in or around a spooky forest known as the Thornwood. But right now, I don't think my players really have any sort of mental image for where anything is. So my plan is to give them a map of what the region looks like. I've actually got the perfect excuse to deploy it now because this last dungeon was up in the mountains. So as they leave the dungeon at the beginning of the new session, they could basically look down into the valley and see, well, basically, the map. So today I'm going to come up with some colorful locations to populate this map with future potential adventure sites. Now, I've known that I needed to put together a map for my players for a while now, but I've been putting it off because I basically thought I needed to give my players a hex map. And I didn't really feel comfortable putting a hex map together since it's something I'd never done before. So I've been doing research and checking out videos from other creators who have deployed hex maps a lot more successfully. Mystic Arts DM made some great videos about exploration, and he has definitely extolled the virtues of using hex maps, because they basically gamify the process of exploration. However, I eventually realized that one of the reasons I'm not excited about putting together a hex map for this group is because I don't think this group really cares that much about exploration. And I'm including myself as part of that. I'm part of the group in that sentence. But considering how most of my players just want action in dungeons, I've been scaling back a bit on how much I use random encounters. Especially because the last time they would have come up, the last time the party hiked through the Thornwood, it would have been the beginning of the session, and I just wanted to get straight into the action and get them into the main story. Now, I do plan to reintroduce random encounters into the game the next time they get into the Thornwood itself and start journeying through the forest to their next destination. I know my players basically want all killer, no filler, but I bet I could come up with some random encounters that don't just feel like random beasts, but instead they actually tie into the other stuff happening in the Thornwood, or at least represent genuine threats or environmental storytelling rather than just, like, here are 5 wolves to fight. And building that kind of random encounter list will almost certainly be the subject of a future video. Sure, expanding the travel time will probably mean more time spent in the wilderness and not in dungeons, which is what my players have been asking for, but I'm not personally of the belief that they have to level up after every single session. I'm okay with a dungeon being a little bit more complicated than that and taking a couple of sessions to explore, so I don't necessarily mind if the road to the dungeon is maybe a little bit more detailed as well. But even with all that being said, right now I don't think my players would be excited about the idea of exploring each hex of a map to discover what's inside. I think that could be a fun campaign to run or play in, and I do think a couple of these players would probably enjoy that format, but I don't think all of them would. Or if they would, I don't think they would because they haven't been prepared for that. They don't think that's what that campaign is right now, and they have no notice that this is how we'd be handling travel going forward, so it would catch them off guard, and I don't think they'd respond well to that. Also, and look, this is 100% a me problem, but I just have never been able to get my head around how big the hexes are supposed to be for the game to be fun. And part of that is because I just don't care about travel distance. I jokingly say this is because I've lived in California for my entire life. I lived in Los Angeles for 10 years. Sometimes it can take you 20 minutes to drive 3 miles. So telling me how much distance is on a map it's just not how my brain works. For me, I'd honestly just rather know how long it's going to take to get there. A hex is 6 miles across, so depending on the terrain, no, stop. I just don't care. When I run Curse of Strahd, I basically just tell my players, you can get from Barovia Town to either Castle Ravenloft or the Windmill by nightfall. You can get from either of those locations to Vallaki by nightfall. From Vallaki, you can get to Krezg or the Winery by nightfall. And if there's anywhere else on the map you're trying to get to, I can basically use those distances to figure out how long it's going to take to get anywhere on the map. That's my system, and it works for the kinds of games I run because it allows me to manipulate travel time with some flexibility to make sure the game is more cinematic and more dramatic. I kind of just don't care about how many hours it would take to cross through individual hexes on a map. It's just not how my brain works. Like when I hear it takes 8 hours to travel through a 6-mile hex in normal terrain, but in that same time the players can only get halfway through a hex in a day if it's difficult terrain, my response is always, Okay, then just make the hexes 3 miles instead of 6, so you can cross 2 hexes in a day, or 1 hex if it's difficult terrain. And then I immediately follow that by saying, wait, actually just give me travel times. That is so much easier. It'll take you 3 days to get through the swamp, but if you want to go around, it'll take 5 days. Done. We're good. That's all I needed to know. And look, I could sit here and say, it's more accurate to what life would be like for people living in a medieval society. They wouldn't have the same attitudes around measuring distance that we do, because we're used to having our precise geographic location available at all times on our phones, but a medieval peasant would just know, it takes me 4 days to reach Camelot.
Well, better get going. With that bridge out, it's a 4-day walk to the palace.
We're to make it back by sunset. We have to leave within the hour.
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
And look, that honestly might be true. Maybe that's a fantastic argument. But that's not why I don't use hex travel in my games. It's because it doesn't interest me at all. And I would like to play a campaign where hexes actually mattered and where that itself was the challenge, and that's what the game was about. I bet you Shadowdark would be a fun game to run a hex crawl in. It's why I'm excited to dig into the western reaches at some point. But right now, and especially in games like D&D, I care so much less about how many hexes you move through per day than I do about where you're going to make camp for the night, because that's an interesting question that I think actually contains drama. If you like hex crawls, please explain why in the comments. Tell me what you think is fun about them. Point me towards some resources that you think would make them sound fun to me. Because right now they just, well, like I said, they just don't interest me that much. However, there are other ways to map your world for your games. I'm a big fan of the YouTubers JP Couvert and MapCrow, and both of them have made some great videos about making maps, and very few of their maps have actually been hex crawls. Instead, they just load their map with points of interest. MapCrow made a great video about illustrating icons on your map rather than just basic topography labeled with interesting names, because your map shouldn't just look like a standard survey map covered with fantasy names. It should actually have points of interest that draw your player's attention toward them. And I believe in one of their videos, I apologize to both creators because I don't remember which of them said this, or if it even was one of them. I've been going back through a lot of their videos as research for making this map and for writing this script, and I can't find the quote I remember, so it could have been someone else entirely, in which case I apologize to that individual for forgetting them as the source. But I remember somebody, at some point, making a great argument comparing maps in D&D to 2 maps that can act as really useful examples of how we can deploy maps in our own games. The first was the map of the world of the original Thundercats cartoon. I believe this map was included within the packaging of some of the toys. And the second map was Disneyland. And when we look at these maps, we obviously don't have an exact sense of scale. These maps don't do a fantastic job of telling us how far away any of these locations are from each other. But what they do tell us is what we can expect when we get to these locations. They show us a bunch of interesting spots and basically invite us to imagine ourselves there. What will we do when we get there? What adventures await us at Splash Mountain or at the Pits of the Mole Men? And I think this is the map I need to put in front of my players. Not literally the map to Disneyland, but a similar style of map. A map that focuses on conveying geography rather than distance, because that's the more important part of the map, at least to me. If my players start looking at this map and asking how long it's going to take to get somewhere, that would be a great problem for me to have to solve, because it would mean that my players see locations on the map that they want to go and visit. So in order to make this kind of map, we have to start by coming up with some locations of interest. I already know that there are 2 more tombs with magic shields stashed inside, but I don't want to put those tombs on the map, because those are hidden locations, and this map represents what you would see from above and what you would hear about from rumors in the local area. Now, the shield they have does reveal those hidden locations and basically point to a couple of locations on this map in order to pique their interests, but that means these tombs have to look like something else, something that's already interesting or dangerous in some way. Likewise, I know that there's a magical vault somewhere that these shields will lead to once the party has all 3 of them, but again, that's not a place that would obviously be marked as a vault if you were just looking at the map from above, although it might look like some other kind of dungeon. So I just sat down and brainstormed a bunch of awesome locations. I wanted enough to really fill up the map with some awesome options, and basically enough to take the players all the way to really high levels. The first few on this list were the ones they've already interacted with, but the bottom section of the list were the items that I specifically generated in the process of building this map. Some of these I've already had planned for a long time. I knew I wanted there to be a floating golden city and a shadowy forest below it. I'd already come up with the swamp as another potential future adventure. Like, I already had a quest that might lead them there, so that swamp just needed a name. And some of these others on this list were just ideas I've had for a long time and that I raided from the archives of my brain to put onto this map, like the Cemetery of the Damned, the Temple of the Elephant, or the Landlocked Lighthouse. A couple of items on this list were generated when I just thought about what monsters I want to include in this campaign. Like, I have one monster in particular I've always been particularly fond of from a lore perspective, and so they're going to need a lair somewhere on this map. So that gives me the Lake of Whispers. I also knew I just wanted a big spooky tree in the middle of the map, because I wanted there to be a major landmark that wasn't obviously man-made, like the lighthouse or the Golden City. I imagined some bodies hanging from the tree, but that actually reminded me of Odin sacrificing himself on a tree to gain lots of knowledge, so that inspired me to label this as the Tree of Lies and Truth. At some point in the future, I'll have to figure out exactly what that will mean for the players when they arrive and interact with it. There are a lot of different ways I can go about that, and I don't have to finalize the mechanics for that right now until I actually know they're going there. I also knew I wanted some hills blocking a view of the Golden City, because otherwise, basically everybody in the party would have already seen it floating in the distance from first level. And I was watching a MapCro or JP Kuvert video where one of them demonstrated this philosophy in action of drawing icons on your map rather than just labeling things and adding distances. And they demonstrated this by drawing wolves next to one of the landmarks, basically hinting at, I think it was werewolves in the video, but hinting that they were prowling in that area. So I basically stole that general idea and labeled these as the Howling Hills. I knew I wanted a spooky castle. I thought I might even steal Ravenloft and put that in the game itself. I'm not necessarily going to go that far, but I did just want something that was just as ominous, like it would have lightning flashing around it. So I figured let's put a castle in the mountains, put some lightning around it, and we'll call that castle Thunder Throne. I wanted another tower, something that might look like it was carved from solid rock, maybe jagged and old. I wanted another tower because I wanted something else jutting out of the ground to draw their focus towards that, but I wanted it to feel distinct from the others. So since it's jagged stone, maybe like a stalagmite out of the ground, maybe I could literally name it something like Snake Fang Tower. Well, no, I've got Snakebite Mountain as someplace the players have already visited. That was a mountain with 2 peaks like fangs. So if this tower is going to be named after a fang, it shouldn't be a snake fang, because then it just seems like the people of this valley have snakes on the brain, because those 2 fangs would definitely not belong to the same creature. They are not to scale with each other. So maybe Dragon Fang Tower. Well, no, that's going to make them think there are definitely dragons inside, and there could be, but I don't want to commit to that just yet. So how about Titan Fang Tower? First of all, alliterative, that's nice. Second of all, it conjures the idea of a massive monster, but because Titans aren't really something we expect to see in a lot of Dungeons and Dragons campaigns as often as, like, dragons, it doesn't funnel the players into assuming it will be literal, which gives me some flexibility when it comes to designing that dungeon. And then I wanted one more landmark, something that could basically act as the set piece for the finale of the campaign, or at least the location that could lead us into the climax that can play out over the final few levels. So how about the Black Door? That was partially inspired by the name of the first game I ran for my LA group. That campaign was called The Vault of Death. But rather than being quite so clear about what specifically is behind this vault door, I just wanted it to be this massive, ominous landmark. I definitely have some ideas about what's going to be behind that door. One of those ideas has already pretty heavily been foreshadowed in the campaign, and it's an element of foreshadowing that my players are definitely aware of and curious about. But I didn't want to give this door a name that would definitely, conclusively, definitively, absolutely establish where this door leads to, because I want my players to wonder and speculate a little bit about what might be behind the black door. So now that I had my list of names, it was time to draw the map. I originally wanted to record drawing this map, but Super Geek Tyke was just really clingy all week. Poor guy, he's got more teeth coming in. So I just wasn't able to get away for any extra time to record myself drawing this map. But on Sunday morning, the morning of the game, I was able to sit down and take all these points of interest that I'd come up with and put them all on the map. I started with a pencil sketch that was very rough and just helped me figure out where each location would appear on the map and roughly how big each one needed to be in order to come across the way I intended, while still being easy to read and also still leaving room for other things on the map. Then I moved over to a new fresh sheet of paper. I just went freehand and started drawing in all the details. My plan was to sketch something a lot more detailed and either draw over it or maybe even reprint it in blue instead of black, so that way I could draw over it and the blue wouldn't show up when I scan the image again. But I just didn't have the time to do that before this map had to be drawn. I literally had like 20 minutes to draw it before the game. Ultimately, what I really should do is find some way to start drawing things digitally, but once again, I was under a time crunch and I knew I would be able to draw this map freehand. I can't necessarily recommend that's how everyone else should do it, but I knew my skill level well enough to know that I would not need to trace anything, and I would still basically wind up with a map I was pretty happy with. I just drew in a few trees sporadically throughout the forest rather than filling in the entire forest with trees, because basically everything here is forest. The whole region is an uncharted forest. But I want my players to be able to write on their copy of the map and mark it up and maybe draw in other landmarks they might discover, like things that could pop up when they come across them in random encounters. There's probably a doorway to the Feywild in here somewhere that I haven't really worried about placing yet because they wouldn't know where it is, and I haven't really decided where it is because that's not the most important thing right now. Likewise, I know that the hag they let live in their second adventure, who got away, has a hut somewhere here. I haven't really worried about placing it yet because that's something that can kind of go anywhere. It might even move. Maybe it literally can go anywhere. So we'll deal with that another day. And I could even drop more dungeons into the middle of the forest if I wanted, things that you wouldn't be able to see from far above, and that maybe there are no rumors about because not a lot of people passed by them. And I have that freedom because there is so much blank space on this map. The biggest challenge was just making sure that all the interesting landmarks weren't right next to each other, but that they still more or less flow toward each other in interesting ways. You don't want all the towers clumped together. You want them spread out so they draw the eye toward these individual points of interest. So making sure the lighthouse and Titanfang Tower are far away from each other was actually one of the hardest parts. So in between the sketch and the final version, I wound up moving the lighthouse to the other side of the map, dropping it closer to the mountains, because I wanted the lighthouse to be far from the lake or the swamp, because I didn't want you to think that this lighthouse was ever in a place that made sense, like maybe the swamp used to be a full lake, but the lake receded and now it's a swamp, or maybe someone might have a lighthouse on the side of the lake. I didn't want any of that. This lighthouse should feel weird. It's just jutting out of the forest for apparently no reason. I also tried to make sure the swamp was in such a position where you basically have to move through the swamp in order to reach a bunch of different landmarks. It's possible to get to the cemetery without going through the swamp, but going from the cemetery to the Tree of Lies and Truth is going to take you a lot longer unless you do cut through the swamp. In my head, Thunder Throne and the Golden City, and definitely the Black Door, are all higher level locations. And in fact, even the lake is going to be pretty nasty once they get there. But the lake and the Howling Hills essentially act as a barrier to separate the player from the more high-level nastiness. At the very least, before they head to Thunder Throne or the Golden City or the Shadow or especially the Black Door, they will have to go through one of these other territories, which are probably going to take more than one session to deal with, which will give me a chance to prep those farther destinations before they might actually interact with them. The same goes for Titanfang Tower and the Temple of the Elephant. I'm actually going to start working on the map for the Temple of the Elephant pretty soon because I have had an idea for that dungeon for a long time. It's inspired by a dungeon I ran in 4th edition, and I just want to expand that concept out in a more interesting way. But that dungeon is going to be pretty elaborate. And while there are some areas on the map where I can make up a dungeon on the fly, I've done that with the last 2 dungeons the party interacted with, actually. Or I could just steal an existing D&D map and throw it into the game, like how Thunder Throne could just be Castle Ravenloft. I have grand and specific ideas for the Temple of the Elephant, so I need to start prepping that soon in anticipation of the day the players eventually interact with it. I put the Tree of Lies and Truth right in the center of the map because that is a potential resource they could come back to multiple times across their journey. I also kind of like the idea that it could be considered basically neutral ground. Perhaps this is someplace they could actually meet with some enemy factions if they want to make a deal with them, although I'm not sure how I will communicate that information to the party. But there's also a dungeon network underneath the tree, and at some point, the player's going to have to head down there and deal with that. They don't realize it yet, but they already have a plot hook that connects to that dungeon. I've also given them a plot hook that can one day lead them to the Swamp of Revelation, but some of these other landmarks are here to just entice them. And by just putting them near other locations that they're being drawn to through plot hooks, I can just trust their natural curiosity to explore these locations. In fact, it's already working. When Sunday's session began, I told the rogue, who's an astral elf, that she got the feeling that if she took the Shield of Stars outside during the night, it would reveal more secrets. So they did so, and the stars on the shield lit up to form a vague map of the valley, and 2 points of light appeared, guiding them toward 2 specific landmarks, the locations of the other 2 Shield-Maiden tombs. But at this point, they also met a new player joining the party, a 13-year-old ranger who had spent a lot of time traveling around the valley. And I had actually given that player the map of the valley right before the session, and she told me that she felt like her character had more or less come up with some of these names on her own, based on rumors he had heard about each location, which worked totally fine for me. So the ranger offered to be their guide and take them to the locations on the map where the other 2 shields were located. Now the party didn't trust her character at first, because I think that's part of the fun for these players, is playing characters who want a good reason to work with other characters in the group. But this meant that until they trusted her character, she didn't want to share her copy of the map with them, because that was her only bargaining chip she could use to gain access to the group. Which meant I kind of made a mistake by just giving the map to one player who was also new to the group. I had accidentally gatekept this information from the rest of the party. My initial plan was for them to look out into the valley and see all these landmarks, and the fact that they were labeled was going to be a bit like cheating, like in a video game when you access a new area and you learn the name of the area, even though your character hasn't actually read anything that would tell them that name, but it is just going to be a lot easier for the players to know what it's called, so we can just give them the name right away, because it's just faster. But because that map had now become not only a physical item within the world of the game, but an item with some actual narrative significance, I couldn't show them a version of the valley that didn't have any labels on it, because I didn't have one because I'd only made the map that morning. So the only version of the map was basically the same one the ranger had, and he was encouraging them to allow him into the group in order to see the map, and they were being really cagey about that. So I couldn't just step in and give them all another copy of the map, because that would essentially mean they had no other reason in character to allow this 13-year-old to travel with them. Now I think experienced D&D players wouldn't have had that same problem, but this group is mostly made up of new players, and they enjoy role-playing through scenarios that a lot of us have just taken for granted as something you have to handwave to get to the action faster. This is kind of a side note, but this group is unfortunately having to learn some lessons the hard way. I find myself dealing with some issues that I haven't dealt with in probably a decade because that's the last time I assembled a group of fully new players. And we'll talk about that another time. These are not bad players, but I definitely took a lot of things for granted when I put together this group, and that's been a bit of a learning experience for me. But in this case, once the players finally agreed to let the ranger into the group, maybe after, 30 minutes of role-playing, he handed over his map, and finally they all know what the valley looks like, and where they were on it. They discovered the locations of the other 2 tombs. One was in the Cemetery of the Damned, and the other was at the Lake of Whispers. Then they debated which one to go to first. That took some time as well, because it's the beginning of a quest, and that's an important decision that we just hadn't had a chance to deal with between sessions or at the end of the last game. Obviously, either of those would have been the ideal time for them to tell the Dungeon Master where they're going next, but we literally hadn't had the tools to do so until this session. But eventually, they decided to go to the cemetery first, because they felt like the lake was going to be higher level. And ordinarily, that's the sort of rationale that I think a lot of Dungeon Masters don't like to hear their players make. We want the players to basically treat this like a real world rather than just an RPG. And so when players say, I bet you this region is going to be higher level, because that's how it works in RPGs, they're bringing their own bias of other games, and in this case, computer games that are definitely inspired by tabletop RPGs like D&D and Pathfinder, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that experience is going to translate into accurate advice in this game. I know a lot of game masters don't like it when their players have that mindset, and sometimes I'm in that camp as well. But in this case, yeah, I put the lake right next to a big scary castle and a flying city and the howling hills and past the Tree of Lies and Truth. I did want them to think it was going to be a little bit more dangerous up there. Now, nobody in the party ever said the words Cemetery of the Damned, they just kept calling it the cemetery, so I don't really know if they just aren't picturing what that could be like right now, but that's fine. I still wanted the lake to feel a little bit spookier, and that worked. Now, I thought they were going to go back to town first. That's where they'd kind of indicated they were going last session, and that's where all the material I'd prepped was. I was prepared with another quest to help guide some people through the forest. We were going to do some random encounters. Maybe not the most satisfying session ever, but there would have been a lot of action, and that would have been fun for the players who just hit 5th level to flex and test out their abilities. But obviously the problem with my idea of where they were going at the start of the session was that I had just dropped a huge load of new information in front of them by giving them this map. So now they didn't feel like they had to backtrack in order to get their bearings anymore. They could just go directly to the next location. Throughout this campaign, it's been my job to put each quest in front of them at the start of a new session. But now they not only have an ongoing quest they can work on, but they have their own map. So they can actually start charting their own course and taking more control over the narrative, which is exactly what I wanted them to do. And sure, that means my plans for the session were derailed. Okay, fair enough. We could still do some random encounters on the way to the cemetery, and we can probably at least do the first level of the cemetery when they arrive. I can run that environment without a ton of prep, because it's modeled after a session I've run in the past. I could do that. But on their way to the cemetery, they decided to stop at the lighthouse, because it was literally just right there. And that means the map is doing exactly what I wanted it to do. It's drawing them toward other interesting locations, even if they don't have any plot hooks to justify them going inside. And theoretically, I could have done the same thing during a normal travel sequence, just have them stumble across a landlocked lighthouse. But in this case, not only did they know to expect it, but they deliberately took the path that would lead them past the lighthouse, because some of them wanted to go check it out. The system is working. They went into a random dungeon for literally no reason, just because it was on the map. The only reason this presented an issue in this specific session is because I hadn't known the lighthouse was going to be so close to where they were until I drew the map about an hour before the game. And like I said, it hadn't occurred to me that they would change their plans and no longer go back to town first. So I had to improvise the second dungeon in a row on the fly, which thankfully I was able to do because I was not coming up with an idea completely out of nowhere. I'd been thinking about what could be in the lighthouse for a long time, ever since I came up with it, which was long before I ever put this on the map. Plus, I didn't actually finish clearing the dungeon, so I can actually take some time before the next session to make the finale really strong. But they went through probably 6 rooms of a dungeon that I basically bullshitted, I think, pretty well. But now I don't feel like I have to do that again going forward. Before the next game, I can prep the final levels of the lighthouse dungeon, and then I can get to work prepping the cemetery and the tomb below, because I know where they're going. This is why drawing a map made such a huge difference in how I run this campaign. I've been spending a lot of my prep time for these games rushing to figure out what is the next adventure going to be. Every session so far has essentially been a blank slate. The players like episodic adventures and dungeons they feel like they can complete in a session or two. So this is not a group that can spend a few levels exploring a mega dungeon. And by that I mean like a few character levels. Like from 4th through 6th level, we're spending it entirely in the Temple of the Elephant. That would not be their thing. And while there are definitely some adversaries out there they haven't dealt with yet that will show up in future sessions, those are fun for me to deploy in the future, but those don't necessarily help tell the players what they should be doing next in the next session. They still need quests, and they basically needed new quests every session or two. And I think the challenge of coming up with a new episodic adventure every month has made it a little bit daunting for me. Obviously, part of the problem is also how little time I've had to spare for D&D prep. You've seen my video output over the last couple months, you know I haven't had like an abundance of free time. But that wasn't the only problem. The problem was I just had to keep inventing new dungeon ideas and new plot hooks to take them there, and because I don't have this back catalog of modules I can draw upon or the time to read a bunch of them right now, it's faster for me to invent those things myself. But very often, the challenge is so daunting that I haven't been able to figure out what the next quest should be. But now, I have a list I can pull from, and so I can actually start to employ the techniques I enjoy to steer them towards specific adventures, like giving them job boards or plot hooks. Or I can even just start to seed rumors into the campaign that can tease out locations the party can go to. Even if they reject all these and wind up making their own adventures, I still feel a lot more prepared now, because I know what locations are on the map, and so I can start to prepare any location, and I know it's likely not going to be wasted content. I knew it might seem counterintuitive that it was actually harder to come up with a new dungeon every month than it was for me to just make a list of 10, but I actually think this is something we're going to talk about in a future video when we talk about running a campaign modeled after an episodic TV series. You need some sort of framework to draw upon so you know what kinds of adventures to present to your group. In TV, that can be a formula or a cast of colorful characters that have very clear desires, or it can be a simple objective. Or, in the case of this campaign, it can just be a specific location that is going to lead to a lot of story opportunities. Without this map, I didn't have the environment I needed in order to come up with more stories. It was like trying to write episodes of The Office without knowing the layout of the office and figuring out more about all the colorful characters sitting in the corners who can actually help push the story forward. Or it was like, well, actually, it was a lot like writing the first season of Lost, because I just had this uncharted wilderness. I would only put things in front of the players once I had a clear idea of what was going to be in them, and I was incredibly stressed about the vast unknown in front of me. Once I had a clear idea of what else was in the wilderness, I could actually start to move forward and properly set up those mysteries. And I still have the freedom to change my mind about things before the players interact with them, but now at least I have some vague ideas about where this adventure is going. But this didn't just help me. I think this helped the players as well, because now they have a quest. In the past, they've been encountering these completely episodic adventures that have nothing to do with each other, and some of them have been getting a little bit frustrated by those adventures. My wife just wants to level up as often as possible, so as long as they level up after each dungeon, she's happy. But the bard wants cool magic items, so if there's not a cool magic item in the dungeon that he specifically feels like he can use that will actually make him useful in combat rather than just spamming firebolt over and over, if he doesn't get something that actually helps him do combat good, he doesn't feel like they got much out of the dungeon. But now they're on the quest for these shields that will unlock this vault, there's this promise of a reward at the end of the tunnel, and that makes him more excited. But also, he's very inclined to steer the party off the road into any landmark they pass in the hopes that they will find some good treasure. Which means as long as I give them some really awesome stuff at the end of the lighthouse dungeon, he'll keep doing that, and they'll keep checking out dangerous dungeons that don't have anything to do with their current quest, if they think they can get something awesome out of it. And if I keep giving them awesome stuff whenever they do that, I can basically reward that behavior, in addition to just leveling them up at the end of each of these dungeons, which is a reward in and of itself. But they'll also get awesome loot they wouldn't have gotten if they hadn't wandered off the path. This also means I have to make these dungeons more dangerous than they would be otherwise. There has to be a clear risk-reward that makes these off-topic dungeons such a gamble. But you know, I'm running a brand new edition and my players don't know how half their powers work, so I don't think I need to worry about that. That's basically going to happen either way. Now, the Paladin wants to track down lore and connections. So whenever they hear about something that doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything else in the campaign, he's trying to figure out how it might be connected. So having these shields that are all linked satisfies his desire for there to be some continuity between the adventures. And if I can weave in some other plot hooks they've received into the lore of some of these other locations, like clues in some of these dungeons that will answer questions about other plot hooks they've heard about, that will also make him more excited to go check out these other adventures in the future. And the wizard was just really excited to go to the cemetery and get the next shield, because I think he likes it when the party has a clear mission. He doesn't like wasting time. I think this is a coincidence, but his character was also a former member of the military, so it perfectly makes sense for his character to like having a clear objective in front of him. But again, I don't think that was on the player's mind. I think he just likes to feel like they're making progress towards a goal. I haven't gotten a sense of what the other two players are specifically looking for from each individual adventure they go on, but that's okay. Just knowing what 4 of my 6 players get excited about helps me take this map and figure out how to turn it into content that my players will enjoy. The one sort of downside of this map is that I don't really have a lot of freedom to put other villages on the map anywhere, except for maybe on the border past the swamp or somewhere completely off the map to the south. But that's sort of the problem with the way I've pitched this campaign. I pitched it as the players heading out into this uncharted wilderness. Really, I should have structured it more like a points of light setting if I wanted to put more villages on the map. That would have helped make it clear that there were other settlements out there in the wilderness you've lost contact with, just because travel on these roads is so difficult. But instead, I made this a lot more like a West Marches style landscape, which is fine. I can do points of light for the next campaign. I've already got some thoughts about that one anyway. But that has actually been one of the reasons it's been so difficult to track down pre-written adventures and fold them into this game. Not just because I don't have a lot of time to read those, but because any pre-written adventure that has a town nearby just doesn't really have a home anywhere on this map. But that's not really an issue anymore. I don't need to keep looking for adventures to drop into this game. I have a list of future adventures now. After this weekend session, I was no longer faced with this just like daunting blank page of having no idea what these characters are going to get up to next. I knew what I could start prepping. And so I actually got really excited and started making a list of a bunch of things I need to do before the next game. Some of them might have been on my list for a while, like making some magic item cards for the items they found, or putting some of the custom magic items onto the D&D Beyond, like I need to write up the stats for the Shield of Stars so the players can equip it. I just haven't done that yet. But I can also start figuring out what magic items are going to appear in future sessions. I can start actually planning rewards for the party. Maybe I'll finally read the new Dungeon Master's Guide and figure out what they recommend for rewards, because I'm literally just rolling a couple of D100s every time they find gold, because I just keep making up these improvised dungeons, so that's the only thing I can think to do. I finally got this creative spark for all this other stuff I want to do next in the campaign, because I finally feel like I can see where this campaign is going. Because I literally can. I've got a map. There's another reason that I've really wanted to make a map for this campaign, so I can upload it to WorldAnvil. WorldAnvil is the sponsor of this video, but I literally use WorldAnvil to keep track of a bunch of details for this campaign. I can use it to make individual pages for each dungeon they explore, so I can write up details for the lore they uncover and the monsters they faced. I'm a little bit behind on updating it. Like I said, free time lately has meant prep for this campaign has suffered, but now that I've got this new level of energy for working on this game in between sessions, I really want to sit down and start adding articles to my WorldAnvil page. And now that I have a map, I can actually upload that directly to the website and start creating articles for each item on the map and linking those articles to the map itself. I can make pages for the dungeons they've explored, the magic items they've got, the NPCs that have hired them, the villains they've faced, that hag who's still out in the forest somewhere, all the stuff I want them to keep track of. And not only can I make articles for the stuff they've already encountered and the dungeons they've already explored, but I can also make articles for the stuff I'm cooking up behind the scenes, and keep those secrets hidden from the other players until the point comes where I'm ready to deploy them and share them with the group. And you can do the same thing for your own games. You can create articles for factions, NPCs, villains, monsters, legends, locations, nations, and more. You can create timelines to keep track of everything going on in your campaign, including secret timelines the players don't have access to, like what the villains are doing. And you can use the autolinker feature to connect all these articles together, so you don't have to scroll through and find the keywords and set up the hyperlinks yourself. You can do all that with just a click of a button. And you can do all of that at an incredible discount. Because if you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you could save 51% off of any annual membership. Yes, that's right, that is more than half off your membership just for visiting worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and using the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout. Thanks so much to WorldAnvil for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank goodness for a video that was not an hour long. And check it out, Oddwick, another video in the can for this month.
That's awesome.
And I should be on track for another Critical Role Demystified video on the last day of the month.
Now, Mike, be careful. You've overpromised in the past, and then those videos haven't come out until several days or even weeks later.
I know, but honestly, there's not a ton I see coming up between now and then that would interrupt this video coming out.
Don't you have family coming into town this weekend?
Yeah, okay, there's that.
And this week, aren't you also driving some shifts of that second job you hate?
Yes, that's true.
And didn't you say earlier in this video that Super Geek Tyke has been really clingy, and so you've had to give him extra attention, and that has already kept you from filming something recently?
Okay, it turns out I can in fact imagine several things that could interrupt this video coming out on time. But I'm still gonna try, dang it. I'm trying to build up a buffer and get ahead of schedule and get out a video every week this month so I can do the same thing next month and try to get back on track. So tune in next time, which will hopefully be July 31st, but if not, then it won't be too long after that. But tune in soon, hopefully very soon, for another episode of Critical Role Demystified. And I've got some other cool stuff coming up as well, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. And click here to check out another video all about this campaign I've been talking about today. It's all about the Azure Fortress I made. That video was pretty good if I do say so myself. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.